Hi folks. Just continuing my theme of what was happening, certainly over in Scotland, whilst Jamie and Claire are forging their new life in North America. In my last video, I mentioned about Bonnie Prince Charlie. I mentioned that his romantic escape from Scotland after Culloden was largely due to the courage and determination of a strong-willed young woman called Flora MacDonald, as many of you will know. So today I thought I should just tell you a bit more about this amazing woman. Now Flora was born on South Uist, which is out, an island out in the Outer Hebrides, so the most westerly islands of Scotland, in 1722, and she was the third and last child of Ranald MacDonald. She had two elder brothers, I think, and her father was a minor member of the Clan Donald gentry. So unfortunately her father died soon after her birth, and her mother subsequently remarried, marrying Hugh MacDonald of Armadale and Skye. So Flora moves over to Skye, and then she's subsequently brought up by her father's cousin, who is Sir Alexander MacDonald of Sleat on Skye. Whilst some MacDonalds remained Catholic, mainly out in the Outer Isles, Flora and her family were part of the Presbyterian majority, so they're Presbyterians. Now, before we go into the whole story of Flora's life, I think there's the most important aspect that we have to keep in our mind here, is that the MacDonalds of Sleat, of which Flora and her family are members, so that's the clan MacDonalds of Sleat, which are part of the greater Clan Donald. They had not joined the rebels in supporting the Jacobite cause. They supported the Union, and in fact Flora's stepfather and her fiancé Alan MacDonald were both serving officers in the British Army. So you need to keep that in our mind as we progress through the events that subsequently happen. So the date is June 1746. 2 months after the Battle of Culloden. Prince Charles Edward Stuart is a fugitive, and he's being hunted throughout the Highlands with a huge price, a huge reward price on his head. Flora at the time was a young woman of 24, and she was visiting the island of Benbecula, which again is out in the Outer Hebrides and just next to Uist. So while she was there, Prince Charles, and he just has this small group of aides left. He's been hunted all around the Highlands and he's been hiding and things such like. So he has this small group with him. They took refuge on Benbecula. The Benbecula then was controlled by a British militia, which was commanded by Flora's own stepfather, Hugh MacDonald. Now, however, through a distant relative, Flora is asked if she could perhaps help the prince. Initially, it is felt she hesitated, rightly fearing what could happen to her family if she were caught. But then she decides she could, and she will. So what happens was she managed to get passes that would allow her to leave the island, to get passage to the mainland. That's what she put down on the passes. So the passes were for herself, a boat's crew of 6 men, so obviously she was going to be rowed. It's quite a long journey actually, and she could take with her 2 personal servants. Now what Flora then did was she disguised Prince Charles as a so-called Irish maid with the name of Betty Burke. So Prince Charles is dressed up and disguised as a female. And on 27th of June 1746, they set sail, or rowing as it were. But they didn't go to the mainland as their passes were. but they took off instead and made for the Isle of Skye. And they landed in Kilmoor on the Isle of Skye, at what is today called the Prince's Point. So that's where they landed. Now, Flora then took the prince to Sir Alexander MacDonald's. That's the family who she's living with. She took the prince and his aides to Sir Alexander's house, where his wife, Lady Margaret, arranged lodgings for them in a small cottage. The next day, Charles is taken by Flora to Portree, and from there he is able to take a boat across the water to the island of Raasay, which is quite near to Skye. Charles is said at that time to have presented Flora with a locket. Flora remained on Skye at Portree, and her and Charles never ever met again. So for those of you who, I know quite a lot of you have been to Skye, and you've probably been to Portree, and if you've been to Portree, you've probably almost certainly been down to the harbour. So anyway, if you have been there, this is the last place that Prince Charles Edward Stuart and Flora ever met, and that's where they said goodbye, and then they never saw each other again. However, the life story is by no means over. 2 weeks later, the boatmen who had rowed them on this journey were detained and questioned, and they confessed. So Flora was arrested, and she was taken initially to Dunstaffnage Castle, which is outside Oban. Again, if you've been up that part of the world, you probably would see it from the road. But then she is transferred to the dreaded Tower of London, which isn't usually a nice place for people to end up. However, Lady Margaret MacDonald, you remember the wife of Sir Alexander, interceded on Flora's behalf, and she was allowed to live outside the tower under supervision, and then she was actually released a year later. So her imprisonment wasn't that harsh at all, and could have been obviously a lot harsher. She had many aristocratic sympathisers to her fate, and they collected £1,500 for her, which I think in those days, I don't know exactly how much that equates to, but I think would be a considerable sum of money. One of the contributors was Frederick, the Prince of Wales, i.e. that's the son of King George, and he is the heir to the British throne, and he contributed money to her. So it shows you just even then how highly she was held in regard. However, so she is released and her life progresses. A couple of years later, on the 6th of November 1750, she's now aged 28. Flora marries her fiancé, Alan MacDonald, and who is by now a captain in the British Army. And at first they moved to live at Flodegary, which is right up the top part of Skye. For those who have been there, there's now a hotel there, Flodegary Hotel, and I think actually you may be able to rent the cottage that they lived in there. I think that may be available. And then Alan's father dies and he inherits the estate, so that's where they are living, and they eventually have 7 children. However, her story continues to evolve. Her husband Alan, unfortunately, wasn't a very good businessman, and he got into debt, and then he fell out with his clan chief over unpaid rent. So things weren't going well for them. So they decided to emigrate to North America, and they decided to go to North Carolina. And they arrived in Wilmington in 1774. So there was already a substantial Scottish population, and most of the members of that Scots population were aware of Flora's activities and how she had helped the prince, and she was quite a heroine. So for those of you who have read A Breath of Snow and Ashes. You'll know that in the book there, I think it's in August 1774, Jamie and Claire meet or attend, I think, Flora's barbecue at River Run. So yeah, so they have established themselves in that part of North Carolina, and as I said, Flora is quite a celebrity. However, the American War of Independence looms, and when it began in 1775, Flora and her husband, like many of the Highlanders, you have to say, are loyalists, and they are loyal to the crown and support the king. And in February, the following year, in February 1776, Alan, her husband, raises a local militia called the Anson Battalion of the Loyalist North Carolina militias. And their sons, Alexander and James, are serving in that. So one legend tells a story that Flora saw the Highlanders off as they marched away, the members of this militia. And what the legend says is, on the public square, standing beneath the royal standard in Gaelic, she made this powerful address to all the Highlanders, with all her power, exhibiting her genius, and she dwelt at length upon the loyalty of the Scots, their bravery, and the sacrifices her people had made. She urged them to do their duty, and was apparently very successful in building up a tremendous morale in them. She then mounted her snow-white horse and bade the Highlanders and her husband farewell, and then made her way back to her plantation. So quite a send-off for the troops, I would imagine. However, en route to the coast, the militia, where they were going to be, I think, taken on board transport ships to be transported up the coast, I suspect, the militia were attacked by a revolutionary force, and a battle took place. It's called the Battle of Moores Creek, and the loyalists lost, and her husband Alan was taken prisoner. So again, her life is thrown into turmoil. Further problems are on the horizon, because the next year the North Carolina Provincial Congress decide to confiscate all loyalist owned properties. So Flora is forcibly evicted from her plantation, and she loses everything, all her possessions, everything. She has nothing left. I think she's able to then go to live just with her daughter. I think that's what happens. Her husband, remember, is in jail. He's been jailed by the revolutionaries. However, after 18 months in captivity, they release her husband, and he's then posted by the British Army up to Nova Scotia, to Fort Edward, and then Flora subsequently joins him there. So that's, I'm afraid, their time in North Carolina probably wasn't maybe the happiest time for them, you might say, because they've lost everything. Flora then goes through a very harsh, I think she arrives there in late autumn 1778, and then they have to get through this harsh winter, and in the following year, in the summer of the following year, Flora decides to return to Britain, and she boards a ship to take her to Britain. But even then, her adventures continued, because the ship she was travelling on was attacked by French privateers, and apparently Flora refused to go below deck during the fighting, and she was wounded in the arm. However, she subsequently made it safely back to Britain, and made her way back to Skye, and where she was joined a few years later by her husband. And then they set up home again, and lived the rest of their life there. So 10 years later, sadly, on the 4th of March 1790, Flora passed away. She was aged 68 at that time, and she was buried in Kilmuir graveyard on Skye, and her funeral was attended by 3,000 people. 3,000 people. And it's said the mourners consumed 300 gallons of whiskey, which I couldn't believe, actually. So that was, I think, a very fond farewell to Flora. June and I made a bit of a pilgrimage to, you can go to see her grave, and June and I made a bit of a pilgrimage to her grave once when we were on one of our regular trips to Skye. So the large memorial that you see there, it was raised by public subscription, so it was all paid for by ordinary people, and it contains this wonderful inscription which says, and I'll have to read this, a name that will be mentioned in history, and if courage and fidelity be virtues, mentioned with honour, which I thought was a wonderful epitaph for her. So, coming back to what I said to you at the start, try and keep in your mind the fact that, you know, Flora's clan don't support the Jacobites, and her fiancé and her stepfather at the time were serving officers in the British Army. The question always in my mind, all down the years, because I've been quite fascinated by this story of Flora MacDonald, was why did she do it? Why did she help Bonnie Prince Charlie? And the answer to that is quite simple, really. She herself talked about it. She did it out of charity. She did it to help Charles because she felt sympathy for him, for this situation that he was in. And Flora allegedly told Prince Frederick, the Prince of Wales, when he gave her that money of assistance, she told him why she'd done it, and she said that she would have done the same for him if circumstances had been different. And I think this is what shows the mark of this amazing woman, that she would risk everything, her life, her family, her home. She would risk everything for humanity's sake, to help a fellow being that's in distress, and that she would assist him and help him for no other reason, not for monetary, political or any gain at all. And for that reason, as I said, she would risk everything. And I think for this, she is rightly seen as a heroine and has come down through history as such. Well, I hope again that you've enjoyed this little historical insight, and as usual, if you have, maybe you could give me a like and share it with your friends. Now, today is Good Friday, and I know normally many of us would be sharing that with family and friends, but now in these difficult times, that is not possible for quite a lot of us, and I think that's hard to take, and certainly for June and I, we are missing our family so much. But what I'd like to say to you is that yes, it is very difficult for us, but we've all got to be strong in this. We've all got to stick together, and together we will win, and good times will come back, and we will all meet again. So we have to stand firm in this. So until such times as we do meet again, I just want to wish you, as usual, the very best from Scotland.